My first degree was in mathematics. I think they're crazy people. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of the crazy people, Randy LeVeque of the University of Washington, who's going to tell us a little bit about the GeoClaw software. So Randy?
Yeah, thank you, James, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It's really great to get involved in this community. There's so many exciting things going on, lots of new things I've learned in the last couple of days. So it's great to be here. So I certainly started out as a crazy person in mathematics, but I've been sort of migrating more and more towards geosciences over the years. I'm on the faculty in the applied math department, but also now adjunct in earth and space sciences and work a lot with people there on various aspects of geophysical hazards in particular. I'm associated with the eScience Institute, which I wanted to say just a word about before I go into the GeoClaw software. This is an institute that's existed for some time at UW, but recently it's gotten a big boost from some grants from the Moore and Sloan Foundations and the Washington Research Foundation and NSF for some training grants. And it's sort of focused on data science and all sorts of different aspects of data science. Since one of the themes of this meeting is models meets data, I thought it would be appropriate to point you to the web pages. One of the ways that I've been very involved in this group is through the Reproducibility and Open Science Working Group, which is one of the things that we take very seriously in terms of encouraging people to develop open source software, share it on the web, also share data, make sure that it's properly annotated with metadata, provenance, licensing, and so on. So we have a Reproducibility and Open Science Working Group. These slides will be posted, I guess, and all of the green links here are clickable, so if you'd like to go and learn more about what we're doing, we're trying to develop some guidelines for best practices in reproducibility, for example. There's also a lot of projects going on related to data science. One I'll mention that I'm not involved in, but that people here might be interested in is a sort of cloud-based service for storing very large heterogeneous data sets and doing analytics on the cloud with that data. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you might take a look at this Myria project. And again, there's a number of other interesting projects going on in the eScience Institute, and a lot of them are connected with the hard sciences, with earth sciences in particular, with some projects going on with seismology and whatnot. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So my own interests are more in numerical modeling, and started out looking mostly at theory of nonlinear hyperbolic conservation laws and numerical methods for solving them, in particular when you have shock waves developing, so finite volume methods that can handle discontinuities in the solution. And then about 1994, I got interested in developing a software package for solving conservation laws and hyperbolic problems in general that we called ClawPack, or Conservation Laws Package, which was actually started right here in Boulder. I was on sabbatical at NCAR, not here, but up at the Mesa, and hid away and wrote a lot of the first version of this software in '94. And originally I wasn't looking so much at geophysical applications, but it's been used for a lot of various things over the years. Soon after I started working with Marcia Berger. Marcia and I were grad students together at Stanford at one time, and her thesis was on adaptive mesh refinement. So she had a code for doing AMR for Euler equations and compressible flow. We kind of merged that into the ClawPack code so we could do adaptive mesh refinement in general. And then about 2004, or a bit before, I had a student, David George, who started working on tsunami modeling and developed sort of the version of the code that evolved into GeoClaw. It's since been used for a variety of other things, and I'll mention some of the applications, but it's been used for flooding problems and storm surge, landslides, debris flows, and other things. Dave George is now at the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory and working in particular on debris flows and landslides. I'll show some of their recent work in a minute. What I've been working on mostly is the tsunami modeling aspect, and we've got a number of projects going on. One is to develop some new inundation maps for the coast of Washington, in particular in relation to the Cascadia subduction zone and the big magnitude 9 earthquakes that happen there every 500 years or so on average. We were also involved in a project, Safe Haven project, to develop what's going to be the first vertical evacuation structure in the US as a location. It's a school that's being rebuilt that will have a platform on the roof that will act as an evacuation structure on Westport, which is one of the sort of peninsulas that's very low-lying and will be, unfortunately, quickly inundated by a Cascadia tsunami. So we've been involved in a lot of different projects. We've also been working on some probabilistic hazard assessment projects to try to look at a range of possible earthquakes and develop probabilistic maps. The basic equations that are in GeoClaw are the shallow water equations, and right now everything that's in GeoClaw is sort of aimed at depth-averaged, two-dimensional flow equations. There's also some multi-layer shallow waters equations. There's the debris flow model that I'll mention later. But the basic shallow water equations have this form, conservation of mass and momentum, except that there's also these source terms on the right-hand side that come from the bathymetry or topography. And then there's also Manning friction coefficients, which I haven't put in here in a frictional term. And there's a bunch of sort of delicate aspects of this that made it somewhat difficult to get this going in our AMR package. You have to worry about the fact that the topography in the ocean is varying on the scale of thousands of meters, whereas the amplitude of the tsunami might be less than 1 meter. And so you have to use what are called well-balanced methods to sort of capture those very small amplitude waves relative to the depth perturbations. We solve everything on Cartesian grids in latitude longitude space, but we use adaptive mesh refinement to be able to sort of zoom in on the areas of interest. So just to give you sort of an indication of how the AMR works, this is a problem from a benchmarking workshop a couple of months ago now. They'll say more about later, but this was looking at the 2011 Tohoku event propagating across the ocean. And this particular benchmark problem was to look at a particular harbor in New Zealand, Tauranga Harbour, which eventually will appear over here in the right, but these are two sort of zoomed views that at the moment show just blue water because all of our grids are sort of concentrated around the tsunami. And you can see we have a very coarse resolution out here. This is Australia and Papua New Guinea. But by sort of concentrating the grid where we need it, this took less than 1 minute to get to 3 hours of simulated time on a laptop, basically. And then going out further, if we sort of concentrate the grids where that wave is, then 6 hours of simulated time takes only about 2 minutes on a laptop. And as we go on, eventually we start refining more around New Zealand, and then this will be the Harbour region. It's taken 5 minutes so far. As we start refining, the computing time goes up dramatically once we put very fine grids in the Harbour region. We're now up to 19 minutes after 13 hours as the first waves are arriving, and 3 hours of computing time to get up to 15 hours of simulated time because there's very fine grids over a fairly large region here. So the computing time is really determined by how fine your finest levels are and how large an area that covers. But the adaptive mesh refinement can kind of track the waves as they propagate, and you can also kind of direct it to do refinement in the regions that you want it refined in. So this was, as I mentioned, for a workshop, and this was one of the optional problems, so we didn't start working on this until like 2 days before the workshop. And so what I'll show is this is sort of the very first preliminary results that we got. It's relatively easy to set up a new problem. You don't have to do any complicated gridding since everything is sort of handled automatically. And so this was the sort of first comparisons that we presented at that workshop. That was the black lines here are measured values of some gauges, tide gauges near that harbor. The red lines are the GeoClaw simulations. There's about a 12-minute lag, which can be accounted for partly by the fact that we don't have dispersion in our model, and partly by the fact that we use sort of an instantaneous uplift for the tsunami. And it's not completely resolved. It also depends a lot what you use as your source for the earthquake, how you assume the seafloor moved, and there's lots of different models for that. But this is fairly encouraging. We've been continuing to work on this problem. And we've done lots of other sort of tsunami simulations and comparisons, which I won't show you, because I think for this audience, there's probably some of the other applications that people have been looking at are maybe more relevant. So let me mention also the use for flooding problems and dam break problems. This is a problem that's often been used sort of as a benchmark problem for flooding in steep valleys. The Malpasset catastrophic dam failure in France in 1959. It's not so clear that the shallow water equations are appropriate for this kind of problem, but it turns out they work fairly well. So this is the valley. The reservoir was up here. The water came down through this valley. And this again shows sort of the benefits of using adaptive mesh refinement for this sort of thing. We don't have to try to grid exactly the valley. Instead, this is actually calculations Dave George did. He started with a coarse grid and then refined to a finer grid here, and then the dam was here, and once the dam breaks, he put down more levels of refinement where the grids aren't shown that sort of automatically capture the flow as it goes down the valley. And so again, you can sort of, without having to make a specific grid for this valley, it will automatically sort of do the refinement in the regions where you need it. So for this particular problem, there is some data to compare against. There were a number of points downstream where they sort of measured or estimated the depth of flooding from the trim line, and also when they could estimate the time of arrival from the fact that it knocked out various power stations along the way. So this is just one comparison of a set of points going down the valley. The sort of greenish dots are the actual field data. The black dots are the GeoClaw estimates of the maximum water level at those particular points. The X's were from a different model that Dave was comparing against. So it's been sort of validated on a number of problems like this as well. This was another comparison that he did of just looking at what happens if instead of using 3-meter resolution on the finest grid, you leave out that finest level, so you only have about 12-meter resolution with the next finest level, and looking at one particular time, the elevation as a function of time, and seeing that you have fairly good convergence, that we don't necessarily need that finest level here. Yeah, so this was going down from 400-meter cells on the coarsest level down to 3-meter cells on this finest level that was following the valley. Okay, more recently, Dave George has been working, as I mentioned, at CVO with Richard Iverson in particular, and they've been developing a new debris flow landslide models. And this isn't yet incorporated into GeoClaw. That's something we'll be working towards in the next few months. But they have a version of it called DClaw for debris flow that uses, again, depth averaged equations like the shallow water equations, but they have the addition, in addition to depth and horizontal momentum, they have a solid volume fraction and a basal pore fluid pressure that can be used to better model debris flows and landslides. And so they've done some tests with this. This is sort of more motivation for why you might want to use this kind of model with a two-dimensional depth averaged equations and adaptive mesh refinement. This is Mount Rainier down here, which is covered with glaciers, and when it erupts every now and then, the glaciers give rise to huge floods and debris flows going down the valleys, and the green areas here are where they've found evidence of past mud flows over the last 5,600 years, and you can see that it flows down towards Tacoma, which is here, and several different valleys and areas that are these days quite heavily populated. So there's interest in sort of modeling these sort of hazards. And again, the actual flows cover a relatively small fraction of this region, and you don't know a priori exactly where it's going to go, so the adaptive mesh refinement and the ability to follow the flow is very useful. This is one comparison they did recently with some data from Mount Meager in British Columbia, which had a massive debris flow landslide in 2010. This is looking at the side of the mountain here. This is sort of a plan view where this is the region of the slide, and it came down the hillside, and then it hit a valley here. Most of it went down the valley and deposited down here, but some of it went up the valley stream in this direction. And again, one of Dave George's simulations where he started with some mass on the mountainside and then used the adaptive mesh refinement to follow it down. Here it hit this valley where part of it started going upstream and most of it downstream, and eventually deposited in a very similar pattern to what was actually observed. They've also more recently been using this to model the Oso, Washington landslide of about a year ago, and in particular to sort of study the sort of extreme mobility of that particular landslide. And they have a paper that just recently appeared on that where they compare the model that they have with different parameter values and show that you can get very different behavior of the landslide and very different run-out distances depending on how saturated the soil was, for example. So I mentioned this tsunami benchmarking workshop. This NTHMP is the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, and they have run a number of sort of benchmarking processes to get tsunami modeling codes approved by that program for use in hazard research. And we had one in February that was focused on currents in harbors, because even when there's little onshore inundation, there can be very strong currents in harbors. There was $25 million of damage or so, for example, in Crescent City Harbor during the Tohoku event in 2011, even though there was no onshore flooding. So there's a lot of interest in looking at currents in harbors, and it can be much more difficult to sort of estimate what the currents are accurately than the flow depths, because the currents vary at much smaller spatial scales, and you can have large vortices that appear in the flow, for example, that can really affect your velocities. So this was an interesting workshop where we were trying to sort of identify what are some of the problems and what works well and what doesn't from about 10 or 11 different models that were represented at the workshop. So I mentioned this Tauranga Harbor problem. We have a web page where we collected some of our results and a GitHub repository for the code that we used for these problems. That's something we've been trying to do with all of our work, is to make the code available and the data that's necessary to run it. But let me show you a few shots from one of the other problems, which was a quite interesting problem. This was a wave tank experiment that was done at Oregon State in their wave tank of a tsunami generated in the wave tank approaching a model of part of Seaside, Oregon, which is a coastal community where there's been a lot of work done on sort of tsunami inundation modeling. And so this is the wave. You can see the wave approaching, and then it washes over some of these buildings here and comes up this street and eventually sort of intrudes between these buildings here. So it's a very complicated kind of flow. When we do tsunami modeling, the current sort of state of the art for inundation maps is to use bare earth topography, where we've taken away, or somebody has taken away all the buildings, and we just have the bare topography, and then we use some Manning friction coefficient that we hope gives a reasonable approximation. But one of the big interests now is in sort of doing more studies of full three-dimensional fluid dynamics in this sort of situation, and seeing how well shallow water equations work if you have buildings, for example, or if you don't have buildings in the topography and are just looking at flow over bare earth, and trying to better understand whether our tsunami models are actually applicable to these sorts of situations. So this particular one, again, we used our GeoClaw shallow water equation model, and the topography that we had was simply a LiDAR scan of this village that had been constructed here. And it was relatively easy to put it into GeoClaw and run the shallow water equation, but then you might wonder, is there any meaningfulness to the results? So let me just back up here for a moment and point out this sort of U-shaped building, which doesn't get overtopped, but there are these buildings just to the north of it that do get overtopped. And then, as I said, the water sort of runs more quickly up this street and through between these buildings. There's a video online if you want to see the full wave tank simulation. So this is the GeoClaw simulation kind of zoomed in on this particular, or one particular part of this model. So here's that U-shaped building and the buildings to the north of it that were overtopped. And you can see in the GeoClaw simulation, we do get overtopping of those buildings, and we do get this run up this street, and eventually the intrusion between the buildings here. And so this was run just using sort of GeoClaw the same way we do typically on bare earth, but using a topography file that included the buildings and the Manning coefficient of 0.025, which is sort of the standard thing we use for tsunami modeling. And then they had, in the wave tank experiment, they had gauges up several of these streets, actually, and we were asked to compare, in particular, the gauges up this street, and looking both at the depth, but also at the speed of the flow and the momentum flux, which is sometimes used as a sort of proxy for what the force on the structure would be. And in these figures, the blue curves are the data that was collected in the laboratory. The red curves are the GeoClaw simulation. And the gauges B1, 4, 6, and 9 were sort of going progressively farther up the street. B9 was way up here. So we didn't capture the flow as well at B9, but at the first one, we certainly captured the main height of the flow, and the velocity of the flow was also fairly well captured. So we found those results encouraging. We're continuing to work on this problem too. We've also been working with Mike Motley's group in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at UW, who've constructed an open foam model of at least part of this. A full 3D model is much more expensive to run. The GeoClaw simulation for this problem takes, I've forgotten what, maybe an hour or so on a laptop. The open foam simulation takes several days. So it's really nice to be able to use these depth average simulations, but we need to do more detailed simulations to sort of validate and figure out whether the shallow water equations are useful and to what extent they are. So this is something that I'm hoping to sort of do more of with the collaboration with CSDMS, that we'll be able to couple our model also in with other 3D models, for example. We're working with this group also to try to eventually couple in the 2D shallow water equations for a tsunami approaching shore with the 3D model to take that as boundary conditions for doing a full 3D model in the region where you really want to do a 3D simulation, for example. We're also very interested in coupling with erosion or deposition model sediment transport. There's one project already going on in that direction. Robert Weiss at Virginia Tech and some of his students have been working on incorporating an erosion model into GeoClaw. This is just one of their figures of the sort of problems they have in mind. They're interested in particular at looking at tsunami deposits and how sand and other material is eroded and then deposited on shore. And looking at tsunami deposits is often one of the best ways we have of sort of looking for evidence of past earthquakes and also helping to validate our models. Okay, so I'm about out of time, so let me just wrap up with a brief overview of what GeoClaw is all about. The main code is written in Fortran with OpenMP for running on multi-core laptops or clusters. We also use Python extensively for the user interface, for input variables, for visualization. Recently, we've been getting it to work also to create KML files so you can view results on Google Earth of tsunami simulations or with other GIS tools. We do all of our development on GitHub through pull requests and issue tracker and whatnot. So if you're interested in following along or getting involved, by all means go to the website and feel free to participate. There's a bunch of people who've been involved in this. I mentioned Marcia, Dave George, Kyle Manley has also been very involved. He's a former student now at Columbia who's been working on storm surge applications in particular. Donna Calhoun has been developing a lot of the visualization tools and working on flow on the sphere. We've had funding from many sources over the years for this project. So finally, let me just mention that if you want to try it out on Beech, it's fairly easy, or on any computer. Basically, all you have to do is download a tar file or clone the Git repository and set a few environment variables. On Beech, I already did that, so you can just set the environment variable to point to my version if you want. And then there's several examples that are built in. This Chile 2010 example, for example, is one of the sort of standard ones that we use. And maybe I can quickly switch to, we have a sort of gallery of ClawPack applications, and in here you'll find some GeoClaw applications. You'll also find a number of IPython notebooks that we've been using to sort of explain some of the tools that we have for dealing with data and whatnot. And if you run that example, that Chile example, by default, we produce these sort of web pages that have sort of animated views of the resulting simulation. So this will take maybe a couple of minutes to run, and it should produce something like that. So I'll stop there.
Well, that was fantastic. Maybe we can have a clinic
Yeah, that'd be great. Love to do it sometime.
down the road. So questions for Randy? Yes, first with Tom.
Great talk. I'm very interested in this AMR part of your model. I wonder if that AMR strategy can be applied, for example, to OpenFOAM or other more complicated governing equations.
Yeah, I don't know how hard it would be to incorporate the AMR into another code. I mean, that's kind of a big, huge part of our code is the whole AMR structure that's been built up over decades now. But the idea is relatively simple, that you start with a coarse grid, and then we have these refined patches where you can refine by pretty much arbitrary factor in each direction. And then there's also subcycling in time, so at every time step on the coarse grid, if you've refined by a factor of 4, say, on your fine grid, you typically have to take 4 time steps on the finer patch. And then within that, you can have many other multiple nested layers. So getting all of that to work is can be a bit of a challenge. And then there's many different ways you can sort of do the flagging of points that need refinement and the clustering of those points in the rectangular patches and whatnot. So there's some references on our website to some of the literature on those algorithms.
That was really cool, and I probably missed it, but so when you do the regridding, and you showed kind of the one example where you showed it was like, I think, a 3-meter versus a 12-meter grid size, and then you showed the other example of the tsunami wave moving, and like there was a coarser or a finer grid around the wavefront. Is that something that's like automated, and the grid is there some kind of learning, like multiple runs to get the optimization? Is that something like the user is controlling, or?
The user has a lot of control over it, although there's also a sort of fully automatic option. So for tsunami modeling, for example, you have to choose some sort of refinement criterion. And for tsunami modeling, you might say, for example, flag any cell where the sea level is more than 10 centimeters away from, or the elevation is more than 10 centimeters away from sea level, flag those points, and then they automatically get clustered. And you could do something like that, but that would tend to sort of refine all of the waves propagating out away from the source, and you might only be interested in the ones approaching a particular location. And so then we also have an option where you can go in and specify sort of regions where you either allow refinement at a certain level or forbid refinement above a certain level so that you can kind of direct it more. I have a student, Brisa Davis, now who's working on adjoint methods that will try to automate it more to automatically figure out where the waves are that are going to reach the point that you really care about, which might not only be the sort of direct incident waves, but there might be waves that reflect off of some other continent and arrive later. There may be edge waves that go up and down along the continental shelf. So it can be hard to sort of do that by hand. So we're trying to make that even more automated by this sort of adjoint approach.
Yes. Chris?
All of your examples were kind of an individual wave, maybe a complicated one. Does it also work if you apply a spectrum of waves like ocean waves on the boundary?
So it doesn't handle surface waves at all. So, I mean, the shallow water equations, they model the long wavelength gravity waves. You could specify boundary conditions for that, and for some of these benchmark problems, for example, we were asked to look at flow in Hilo Harbour, where what was prescribed was what was happening at one particular gauge, and then we had to specify boundary conditions to sort of give a tsunami with that wave pattern entering the boundary. So you can do that, and certainly for the wave tank experiments, you also have to sort of specify boundary conditions. But for the global sort of tsunami modeling, we cut off the ocean at some point, and then we have pretty good non-reflecting boundary conditions so that waves that hit the boundary disappear from the computational domain.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.